Coming up next on Arizona Horizon, the Journalists Roundtable looks at efforts by some businesses to fight the governor's executive orders to close. Also tonight,
and the combination of power and authority with bias is what leads to the privilege.
we hear about concerns over bias and privilege in society. Those stories and more next on Arizona Horizon.
Arizona Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of Arizona PBS, members of your PBS station. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to Arizona Horizon. I'm Ted Simons. Governor Ducey today announced that the state will be receiving an extension of federal unemployment benefits by way of an executive order signed last week by President Trump. The federal jobless payments will be $300 per week. They'll come out of FEMA funds and they'll be coupled with the state's existing $240 weekly payment. The president's order called for each state to chip in an additional $100 million in order to receive the federal money, but Arizona is not adding those or any other state funds. Still, the state expects quick approval of its application. The individual payments will be made retroactively after July 26th to those who qualify. Secretary of State Katie Hobbs is calling for the state attorney general to investigate if the Trump administration's recent changes to the U.S. Postal Service break Arizona election law. Hobbs said today that it's against state law to delay the delivery of a ballot, and she wants Attorney General Mark Brnovich to immediately investigate hiring freezes, the removal of mail sorting machines, and other recent moves at the Postal Service to see if those changes indeed break state law by delaying the delivery of ballots. Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez is calling for all public and private schools on the tribe's reservation to use online learning this upcoming semester. The announcement comes as the tribal nation continues to see declining cases of COVID-19 and as school districts around the state struggle to determine when to go back to in-person instruction. As for today's COVID-19 report, over 900 new cases in Arizona with a percent positive rate at 8%. Total cases now approaching 192,000. We also had 40 new fatalities confirmed. Total certified deaths from the coronavirus now at over 4,400. And the hospital report shows continued declines in acute care and ICU beds in use due to COVID-19. Emergency room visits, though, they were up for the day. President Trump's campaign confirms the president will appear next week in Arizona. He'll speak Tuesday at an airport hangar in Yuma, where he's expected to compare his immigration policies with those of Democratic candidate Joe Biden. Governor Ducey, Senator Martha McSally, both scheduled to attend the campaign event. The president plans to visit 3 other states next week as the Democrats hold their national convention. And in a rare economic bright spot, retail sales in the U.S. showed a slight increase last month. The 1.2% hike put the country's sales figures back to where they were in February. Most of the increases are from online transactions, which helps explain why even with better sales figures in recent months, a record number of retailers have declared bankruptcy or closed down during the pandemic. As mentioned earlier, school districts are struggling to figure out how best to follow state guidelines for returning to in-person classroom instruction. That's just one of the things we talked about in our abbreviated edition of the Journalists Roundtable, this week with Maria Paletta of the Arizona Republic and Howie Fisher of Capital Media Services. And thank you both for joining us on this Journalists Roundtable. Maria, we'll start with you. And the governor spoke yesterday, kind of answered questions, I should say, yesterday about reopening schools. It just seems like this is one big mass of confusion out there.
Yes, there are plenty of confused parents and students and members of the community right now. Of course, last week, school leaders and health leaders released that series of benchmarks to guide decision-making for school leaders when they were considering whether to reopen their districts. But unlike the reopening guidelines for businesses, they're not mandatory. They're more of a suggestion than something that districts have to do. So while Superintendent Kathy Hoffman has encourage schools to adopt those guidelines and push an in-person learning start date back a bit if schools are in communities that are still experiencing high infection rates, as most of the state is. She's encouraging them to hold off, whereas Governor Ducey yesterday said he was very supportive of getting students back in school if that was something that school leaders felt they could do safely.
And Maria's point is very critical because of the fact that he has told the gyms, the bars, the fitness centers, the splash parks, you can't open. It would be dangerous to health to have all these people together, which led to the question yesterday of, so having all those kids together is not a problem for health? Well, these are guidelines and it depends on the mitigation measures. Look, this is a governor who's trying to balance himself between the issue of he really screwed up when he first reopened the place, and a president who has been pushing for reopening, and a U.S. education secretary who's threatening to cut funding. So he's in a no-win situation, so he's decided to do what he does best, which is punt.
Yeah, and Maria, we're hearing reports that teachers are, some teachers do want it. I think the governor mentioned yesterday, there are teachers who can't wait to get back in front of a classroom. There are a lot of teachers who are concerned, have health concerns regarding in-person learning and a return to that form. We're seeing teachers resigning.
Right, absolutely. And that is something that has been part of this conversation for months now. We've seen, and of course, this is not for sure since health experts are still learning about coronavirus and its transmission, but that kids are less likely to fall very ill with this virus, but that doesn't mean that they are not carriers. And when you have a school, you are not staffing it with kids. You have teachers, many of whom are older, support staff, bus drivers, everything else. So certainly a lot of professionals that staff schools are scared to go back and don't feel ready yet.
And Howie, real quickly here, the governor and state superintendent of public instruction, Kathy Hoffman, there's been some kumbaya here so far. Are the paths starting to diverge a little bit?
Well, I think she believes that if she works with the governor, she can push him in the right direction. Look, it was Kathy who pushed him into the whole idea of metrics. He originally said, well, we're going to have this August 17th date, and maybe yes, maybe no. But she, along with some other public health experts, pushed him in that way. And I think she will tell you, I am not at odds with the governor, but I'd like to be able to push him in that direction. And the fact is that she has been very successful. She's even gotten some national publicity in terms of her efforts. And I think that's a good position for her. This is a very young woman who probably has some future political aspirations.
Let's move on here. And Howie had referred to this. Maria, I want to ask you about the continued fights over the governor's executive orders. You got water parks, you got property owners with the renting moratorium, you got gyms, that relentless fight there, all fighting the governor's orders.
Right. As one of my colleagues said earlier this week, who has not sued Governor Ducey at this point? I think right now it's only movie theaters, if I'm remembering correctly. But yes, we have the ongoing saga with gyms. That's maybe been the most high profile. The governor and Dr. Kara Chris with the health department released those reopening guidelines that, as I said, are mandatory, not recommendations, earlier this week, and provided a process for businesses affected or shuttered, I should say, under the governor's June order to basically say, to make their case for reopening if their county is still experiencing substantial spread. But some of those gyms feel that that's not good enough. Some opened in violation of that already this week. And, enforcement is kind of tricky because it's left up to local governments and local law enforcement agencies, which are not really patrolling gyms for bad behavior right now. So that's been a bit tricky. And then you have Sunsplash Water Park upset because they need to remain closed, while their argument is you have resorts and hotels with splash pads and water slides and hot tubs and everything remaining open. You have landlords upset about the eviction moratorium being extended for renters. So there are quite a few community members and business owners at odds with Governor Ducey right now.
And the landlord's lawsuit, quite frankly, is the most interesting because it goes to two issues. What the gyms are challenging has to do with how he's enforcing his orders. What the landlords are saying is you have some powers under emergency laws. But first of all, we question whether the legislature could have given you those powers. And more to the point, the powers are designed to protect public health. The governor has essentially admitted that he's trying to protect economic interests. And the seizure of property, whether it's temporary or permanent, if I'm reading the law correctly, it says you can seize property during a time of war. Now, you may want to call it a war on coronavirus, but this is not a time of war. And I think it'll be interesting to see if the Supreme Court decides, well, maybe it is time to decide how far do the governor's powers extend. I know
And,
he
and I,
believes he can do pretty much anything he wants. I'm not sure the courts will buy that.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting, Maria, to see how far, and you kind of referred to this as well, these renegade businesses, some of them are just opening anyway, saying, come and get me. And I mean, after a while, you just wonder how far that's going to go.
Right, absolutely. Enforcement has been an issue. I mean, not just with businesses, renegade businesses, as you said, but other restaurants. I mean, people with not wearing masks and getting into shouting matches at shopping centers and so forth. So that's certainly been an ongoing problem. And like I said, not the number one public safety priority for local officials right now. I
But
do. Oh,
Howie,
sorry.
real quickly, the president and the administration looks at Arizona and says, there is how you do it.
Well, that's all very interesting, particularly since we know, those of us who live here, how badly Governor Doug Ducey screwed up in reopening things in the first place. It's nice to say, oh, now we're doing very well. Well, you've got over 1,000 people who died in the interim. I think this also comes down to the fact that the president needs Arizona, not only for his own reelection, he needs to keep Martha McSally there because the US Senate balance may hang in that. So of course they're playing kissy face. The governor went, and in fact, the president appointed him co-chair of an advisory council. So it's sort of, I love you. No, I love you more.
Yeah, and Maria, we'll close out with that. Vice President Pence here this week, the president here next week. We're going to see a lot of this come November, right?
Absolutely. Trump has obviously been here multiple times, the vice president as well. Arizona is really considered one of those battleground states as we head into November, and especially after the turnout that we saw in the primary and how that compared to past years. I think there's some concern about which way Arizona is going to go.
All right, Maria Paletta, Arizona Republic, and Howie Fisher, Capital Media Services. Thank you both. Both of you have a great weekend.
And stay healthy.
And up next on Arizona Horizon, how racial bias and privilege appear in everyday life and how to start conversations of change.
A photograph has a meaning that goes deep beneath the surface, and nobody knows this better than the royal family themselves.
I'm going to open up the Royal Photo Album.
Anwar, tell me the story of this picture here.
From creating a new sovereign to affairs at the heart. I'll hear behind-the-scenes stories from these unforgettable images.
It's a glimpse of life in the royal family as never before.
All new, Sunday night at 7 on Arizona PBS.
Racial bias and privilege are of increasing concern as the country becomes increasingly aware of issues involving racial and social justice. We talked about bias and privilege with Dr. Neil Lester, the founding director of ASU's Project Humanities. Dr. Lester, good to see you again. Thanks for your time on this. This is interesting stuff. Let's define terms. Racial bias and privilege. What are we talking about here?
Well, I propose that we rethink how we talk about diversity. And the one way of doing that is by bringing in terms like privilege and bias. And what's often misunderstood about privilege is that people often go to this point of what they've done individually. Like, I've worked hard for this. That's not the privilege I'm talking about. The privilege I'm talking about, Ted, is, can you see me now, Ted? Can you hear me, Ted? That's the privilege I'm talking about. Stuff that you're able to do that society accommodates you for that you did absolutely nothing to earn. And that's what's often invisible to us, as we all have privilege at the same time that we don't. The bias comes in is the ways in which we base our interactions on what we have already experienced, i.e. stereotypes, versus what's right in front of us. So it's the sort of thing where we say, I can't hear what you say because I see what you do. So we say we're committed to diversity, but yet the leadership of our organizations, the people who get paid the most money, don't represent very diverse peoples. That's what we're talking about. And the combination of power and authority with bias is what leads to the privilege, the systems of privilege, whether it's sexism or heteronormativity or linguicism or ableism or ageism or classism or all those isms that we want to relegate to identity politics.
Has it always existed, or is this something that we're just now talking? Why are we just now talking about it?
Well, it, yes, has always existed, those isms. What has evolved is the language that we have to name it now. because people knew that there was inequality. People knew and experienced inequities. We just have a name for it now. And so it helps, I think, if we can sort of understand this in a context of as language involves, so there are experiences involved, and the complexity of having to name them evolves. So no, it's not new. We have always had, in fact, we're talking about that now when we talk about, what some people don't want to talk about, which is not just calling something racism, but we're actually naming it now in these last few weeks as white supremacy. And within white supremacy, it's not about those who are white supremacists. It's those who somehow think whiteness is an ideal, is the standard, and the only standard of value and merit. That's the conversation has shifted.
Is that idea that whiteness is the only standard or value of merit, is that something conscious? Is it unconscious? Is it, do you have to wear a hood and start burning crosses, or how does this work?
That's how it works. You just named it there. What's interesting about it is that it's unconscious to those who are often experiencing it. It is not unconscious to those who are witnessing it. So, for example, I ask on your particular show, Ted, how many of the various hosts on PBS have been women? And of those hosts, how many of them have been of color? That's when you start seeing the ways in which it manifests itself. So that's not conscious. I don't think people say we're going to exclude women, but if you don't have women in those spaces, then inherently you are not practicing what you are allegedly preaching.
How have those people, whether it's in this industry or other industries, academia, pop culture, Hollywood, all over the place, how have they, has it again been an unconscious barrier, or, you got the Oprahs of the world, everyone will say, you look at this, you got Oprah, look at this, you got other
but that's,
how's that working?
That becomes about exceptionalism though. So you can always have somebody, it's like that conversation where somebody says, Dr. Lester is my Black friend. But when you start examining your circle of influence and your social circle, then you ask, well, why is it that you only have one Black friend or one LGBT friend or one transgender friend? That's when we're talking about the ways in which it's not conscious. You don't gravitate, when you decide that you're going to trust someone, you don't gravitate towards somebody saying, I'm going to trust you. You gravitate them because there's something that aligns with your values. And it plays out in very unconscious ways for those who are often participating in the decision, but not for those who are witnessing it. It's very clear.
With that in mind, for most of us of a certain age, we were raised to be colorblind. Taking Martin Luther King Jr.'s words and saying, you don't look at the color of someone's skin, you look at the content of their character. Has that view changed, morphed? What is it still work? Because I'm hearing now you do look at someone's color now and realize where they're from and what they've experienced.
Well, it's interesting because I'm not even quite convinced that that's what MLK says when he talks about judging people by the content of their character, because he does acknowledge difference in that. He talks about a poor people's movement, so there's difference there. So I think inherently what we're trying to get at is not to look at difference with value, because I can say that that is a Black pen or that is a Black car and have no value associated with that. But when I say, for example, I was driving down the road and a woman cut me off, the question is, why is it important that I acknowledge that a woman cut me off? Or if you're standing in a grocery store and you, Ted, say, someone blocked my path as I was trying to go up and down the aisle, you say a Black man did it or a Black woman, then the question becomes, why do we put value on that? And things can be quite neutral, but they remain neutral only within the space that it often has nothing to do with people. So here's another example. Language is also embedded with these kinds of racial biases and gender biases. When we talk about Black male or Black magic or Black hole or Black ball or Black list, all of those things carry a negative connotation. But if we talk about a little white lie, or we talk about Black magic, then there are ways in which whiteness, even within Christian iconography, is still about purity and rightness and everything that is good in the world. Even if we talk about being, for those who are believers, talk about being washed by the blood, then you become whiter than snow, whiter than snow. We talk about purity. We still see that manifested in some traditional weddings where brides walk down the aisle and they have to be in white. So there are all kinds of ways in which we manifest these biases, even embedded in the language. So I don't know. The issue is that both these things happen simultaneously. So we can be very unaware of, but somebody else can point that out. And why we have to be held accountable, and we also hold others. And so keep in mind, I'm also suggesting that we all have them. We all are privileged at the same time we are not. So even as I am African American and male, I still have to the fact that I am male and that my reality when I walk from my class at night is not potentially the same reality as a woman's reality might be, walking from a class at night and not fearing that they need an escort who is likely to be male.
Okay, and with that in mind, last question here. When you understand that, when others at least are aware of privilege and bias, the conversations happen, the conversation started, and it continues. But what's next? Then what happens?
Well, you first of all have to self-reflect and figure out, what am I bringing to the table that I'm not assessing where we are right now in the moment, and why am I relying on some past experience? So what you do is you have to confront your bias, first of all, and there are all kinds of ways to do that. You can take tests and figure out, where are your biases? Because if you know your biases are there, then you can address them. The problem becomes when you don't know. So that's why we have to step outside of our comfort zones and have those who can check us professionally and personally on our biases and call us out on that, and have us not become defensive or angry or sad or guilty because we have privilege. There are ways in which we step into our identities and our histories are written on us that we have no control over. Ted, you look, and as you present, more like a founding father of our country than I do. You're not responsible for anything that happened, but you certainly reap the benefits of that in the same way that I then become what is associated with criminals and lowlifes and all those things that we associate with Black. And it has nothing to do with what I have done in terms of getting a degree and being a publisher and a scholar and all of that stuff. If I walk down the street, then I become any other Black person who could be George Floyd.
Are you optimistic? Are you optimistic that things are changing?
Well, I don't think in those linear terms. I kind of look at what's happening right this moment. And I say, how do I feel right this moment? And acknowledge the fact that that could change in a heartbeat. Nobody woke up the day that George Floyd was murdered and knew that we would be witnessing that. Nobody knew that we would be going through this pandemic, and the pandemic itself has revealed those biases. The fact that you and I have the privilege of being able to social distance in ways that people who are on the front lines, who are in low-paying jobs, cannot do that. So I'm reminded and hopeful as I experience things. But to somehow say, I want to borrow from James Baldwin, who says, I can't be pessimistic about race relations in this country because I'm alive. And I think my understanding of history and my ancestral history is such that all kinds of things come out of an awareness, and that I can't just bury my head in the sand and say, woe is me. There are ways in which we are surviving and thriving despite all those things that happen. But as we see more allies and more people coming on who are talking about sexism, who are talking about homophobia, who are talking about linguicism and ableism, then I'm certainly encouraged by that.
Dr. Neil Lester, ASU, boy, a lot to think about there. You gave us a lot to consider. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Programming note, Arizona Horizon's 5:30 edition will be preempted all next week due to PBS NewsHour's live coverage of the virtual 2020 Democratic National Convention in Wisconsin. But you're invited to join us after NewsHour coverage for our 10 p.m. edition. And Monday at 10 p.m. on Arizona Horizon, we'll speak with a delegate to the Democratic Convention about this year's unique virtual gathering. And we'll hear from a teacher in Queen Creek who's decided to leave his job rather than return to in-person classes. It's Monday on Arizona Horizon. That is it for now. I'm Ted Simons. Thank you so much for joining us. You have a great weekend.
Arizona Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of Arizona PBS, members of your PBS station. Thank you.
There's never been a more important time to make sure facts and the truth are driving conversation. Washington Week is an island of civil discourse in a chaotic media environment. On Friday nights, we gather the best reporters in the nation to unpack what's really happening and have a conversation that's not about point of view, but about informing the American people.
Washington Week.
All new, tonight at 7 on Arizona PBS.
If you like sparkling comedy,
music, and dance,
we've got nothing for you.
Much Ado About Nothing,
Shakespeare's witty battle
between love
and loathing. Join us for the fun of Shakespeare in the Park's
Much Ado About Nothing.
I'm ready on great performances.
Tonight at 8 on Arizona PBS.
This month in Passport, your on-demand library of the best of PBS.
I saw the man who did it.
You saw who killed Molly Andrews?
Stop! No, in my head, it was a vision.
People really hadn't seen anything like Mae West before.
You better come up and see me.
I'm exploring the secrets of 3 most extraordinary queens.
It's some of history's biggest myths.
These and other shows are available with Passport. Become a member of this PBS station. Sign in and start streaming today.
The race for president is on. Next stop, Milwaukee for the Democratic National Convention. How will the Democratic Party unite behind former Vice President Joe Biden?
This campaign will send Donald Trump packing. It's about leading this country and leading the world once again.
What's the party's message for the American people? A PBS NewsHour Vote 2020 election special.
Starting Monday on Arizona PBS.
On Nova, who wins the battle of the senses? How do animals experience the world?
There are animals that have completely different senses than we have.
A new look inside animal minds. Dogs and super senses.
Wednesday night at 9 on Arizona PBS.